Jacob Taminosian, Senior Ecologist of Passarella Associates, joins us in the studio all the way from Fort Myers to teach us about wetlands and the Florida panther. We hope you enjoy.
In Our Expert Opinion podcast is brought to you by SVN Saunders Ralston Dantzler Real Estate, a full-service land and commercial brokerage with over $4 billion in transactions since 1996. Linda, you're live.
Thank
Action.
you. Thank you, Chad. I actually never know how to start these out, and I think I always am like, welcome back to In Our Expert Opinion podcast. But I feel like there should be something cooler, but I just don't know.
What if you listen to like 2 or 3 of them in a row? Welcome back.
Ugh.
Well, I've already been welcome back. I'm already here.
Our poor guest, I think he listened to 3 in a row.
Yes, it's subsequent back to back.
Chad and I were talking about, and we've said this multiple times, or I have at least, that this is In Our Expert Opinion podcast, but it's not our expert opinion. We have our guests who have expert opinions. And
Because they are
expertise.
experts.
They are experts. I have yet to meet somebody who I don't consider an expert. As a matter of fact, some of our guests are so expert that I don't even know what they're talking about.
Yes, you want to present to the layman or laywoman, the layperson.
Yeah.
And put these concepts in a way that are digestible by other people.
Yeah, especially me. Mostly me, I would say.
Yeah, the host is
Yeah.
critical.
I would say mostly.
Linda, you know what a good start is?
Introducing the guest.
And pronouncing their name correctly.
So our guest today is Jacob Taminosian.
That's great.
Nailed it.
What if I would have gotten your first name wrong? That would have been really embarrassing.
Tomato.
Jacob
Tomasino.
Taminosian. Yeah, the mob boss.
Yeah. With Passarella
Correct.
and Associates down in Fort Myers.
Correct. Yeah, offices in Fort Myers, Sarasota, and South Carolina.
Did you ever see Ted Nugent in Fort Myers?
I've not encountered Ted Nugent, but
I'll tell you what he said after we record because I can't say it on the air, but it was like pretty funny.
To you?
Directly to me.
Okay.
Yeah.
what's he an expert in?
All things outdoors.
Running that gator, yeah.
He is an expert marksman. I can say that.
Fair.
Do you think we'll talk about gators today?
We can.
Yeah.
Yeah. Alligator mississippiensis. That's the scientific name. And that's a mouthful.
Mississippi.
Mississippiensis. Yeah, a lot of times the species name in the nomenclature relates to something about the species, whether it's where it was discovered or some sort of superficial trait. Sometimes it's Latin, but I'll spare you those details.
I like the
there's-
Indian name for alligator.
What?
I don't know it off the top of my head. But I love it when it's said.
Like Native American?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There's all these depictions of alligators in some of these early Florida expeditions. I can't recall offhand the name of these early explorers, but some of them look nothing like alligators. It's like the depictions of dogs, like or medieval.
Of the dogs and the cats,
yeah,
yes.
or babies.
They're ridiculous.
Yeah, no
They look insane.
No semblance. It's like
You
this-
almost wonder, like, is that how they used to look? And now we're so, like, far evolved that
maybe those.
I'd rather look like
That was
this.
prior to corrective vision, so that's
True
could be
enough.
part of it.
People might have not even had 2 eyeballs back then. We don't know.
Yeah, Cyclops.
I guess we should say what you do. You're a senior ecologist. And what is that?
So, senior ecologist is just a title. It's like a senior project manager somewhere else. But the progression in this industry is kind of eco or ecologist 1, biologist 1, 2, 3, and then once you become a project manager, within a few years you would get that designation if you warranted, if you merit it. So, I, for all intents, I manage the projects we have as an ecological consultant. So. If you're asking about the industry just in general, we would do kind of the wetlands permitting, wetlands delineations prior to that, some of the listed species, surveys and permitting as well. It's an entire industry of itself, and we work with engineers, planners, surveyors. We don't provide that in the same roof, but a lot of companies do.
Yeah. No, you guys are an integral part of real estate.
Yeah. Definitely, there's a component, especially in Florida. A lot of these projects, I've heard planners say this, are increasingly prickly.
Yeah.
Between all the, in the entitlements process and beyond, environmental has played an increasingly important role, particularly in Florida, because of the regulations.
Well, and we were talking a couple days ago about wetlands, and I've talked about that a lot on the podcast, but maybe we haven't done the foundation and exactly said what it is and why it's important. And with that,
Sure.
I'll let you take it away. You can move this if you need
Yeah,
to.
no, I'll adjust the spacing. So a wetland, when we think of wetlands, and other guests have articulated on this, but it's really where there are low spots and the water's accumulated, and as a result of that, you'll have these what are called hydrophytic vegetation species, plants that naturally are adapted for wetter environments where they may not be able to transpire the oxygen in the same way that plants that are in a saw palmetto prairie are on a pasture, or the Floratom, the St. Augustine grass that's in your yard. These are kind of naturally depressional areas that have, as a result of that, vegetation, as I said earlier, soils, hydric soils that are characteristic of wetlands, and then the hydrology, which would just be anything from the water itself to indicators of hydrology. So, like a water line on a cypress tree, for example, because these wetlands they seasonally fluctuate in their water level. So, you might walk into somewhere, and if you didn't know the vegetation, you'd say, "Oh, there's no water here; it's not a wetland." But there's indicators to us. The soil being a big one. Something cannot look like a wetland. It may not pass the smell test. And this stuff there's technical definitions in the Florida Administrative Code. But to the layperson, they may walk into an area and say, "Oh, there's no water. This can't be a wetland. Why are they telling me I need a permit to fill it?" And so on and so forth. But
Yeah, it's interesting because, sometimes we show property and, like you said, there's not standing water on the ground. So people are like, no, that's not wetlands. But in fact, there's a lot
clues.
of, yeah.
Yeah, almost like a forensic case. If you're trying to piece together the puzzle of if something is actually a wetland, and we have basically a handbook where we can look at and perform these tests that the state has developed, and the federal government may use different standards. It was U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and still is in some cases, and now it's Florida Department of Environmental Protection, who a lot of people seem to know. But yeah, it goes into gross detail on kind of what are we looking for to call it a wetland.
And now, I would think sometimes people would want their property to be wetland or they would not want it to be. So, I mean, if you're a property owner, what are the advantages or disadvantages of having that? I don't even know how you say it.
What?
Designation?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, you could refer to the classification,
Yes.
designation. You look at like municipal maps that the counties put out, that their GIS services put out, their global information service, and it might show things that have been classified as wetlands because of soils maps. But all this is done with remote sensing, with satellites, looking for cues in the signatures on the maps. But returning back to your question, it can be wetlands are advantageous in general. I mean, they provide flood attenuation. They filter water that recharges the aquifer that we ultimately drink. Coastal wetlands like mangroves, especially you hear about like Hurricane Ian. I'm from Fort Myers. We experienced the effects of that. But those types of wetlands would act as natural buffers to some of that surge. And then aesthetic value, undeniably, wetlands beyond just the kind of the pragmatic or practical features, they're pretty, right? And they host wildlife. So, and there's no shortage of that in Florida, in part because of the wetlands that we have.
They host alligators.
They do. Yeah.
Now, have you seen, and I didn't even know this until I was on Instagram maybe like 2 weeks ago, and what are all of these like crocodiles doing?
So, well, crocodile is not the same as an alligator.
No.
They're in Florida at least. The alligator is listed or protected. You can use.
Do you
those
think
terms.
that there's too many?
Alligators?
Yeah.
I won't opine on that. I don't. I can't say, but they are protected because of their similarity in appearance to the American crocodile, which you're only going to find really in parts of the Everglades, coastal.
Well, I saw that it was in Fort Lauderdale.
Brackish, or saltwater type habitat.
I'm like, I didn't even think that that was here. I thought that that was in Australia. I don't know.
Or Africa.
Yeah.
There are some, and then they're far less abundant.
They scare me worse than the alligators do.
Yeah, they're
I feel like they are like vicious.
they're menacing.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're menacing.
Like I feel like an alligator, they'll probably attack you if they're feeling like it. But a crocodile, you can pretty much like you can bet your bottom dollar that they're gonna try to come like for you.
Well, you know why they're so ornery.
No.
They've got all those teeth and no toothbrush to brush them with. That's from Waterboy. And
Yeah,
that was filmed. That scene was filmed. Chad sounds like he may have known, but that was filmed in
You
the
got
same
it.
class I took botany in at Florida Southern.
Oh really?
Go Mox.
Oh, go Mom.
Yeah.
There you go.
The medulla oblongata scene. That was in Florida
I have
Southern.
not seen that movie
Oh,
in
man.
18 years. It's got to be.
Yeah.
But you know who probably has seen that is my friend Zeb, who works here, who told me last night he was eating 5 cookies and watching an Adam Sandler movie. So
Well, that sounds like an enlightening.
I know. I know. Okay, so that there's like all of these wildlife species that are in the wetlands. They look nice.
Right.
They are very important for the aquifer.
Sure.
But it's like, obviously, if I have a client who's buying a property, we don't want 70% wetlands.
Sure.
We want 70% upland. So, I mean, what are some like, what is there anything that can be done about this?
Yeah. I mean, there's avenues for this. It's in Florida. There's the environmental resource permitting program. I think if you listen to Robert Angus Williams' podcast, he can get into some of the nuances really where it gets really sticky in some of these cases. But in general, in Florida, you're almost always going to need an environmental resource permit, an ERP. There's thresholds under which you wouldn't need them, but and there are exemptions for certain types of activities or general permits, which the state has sort of already issued. But if you have wetlands on your property and there's a chance that you may clear or fill them, then you're almost certainly going to need an ERP. And there's 2 components to that ERP. There's the environmental, which is what we do, the wetlands listed species side, and then there's the engineering, the stormwater. And again, Robert talked about this big aspect. If you think about a parking lot, you think about a pasture. They both happen to start with a P, so that works well for this. But you pave it, right? The water that was naturally percolating into
I was just laughing.
percolating. I'm not intending to use all these P's, but it's happening. So
Good job.
So the water would not naturally percolate and flow to sort of the lowest point, whether that's a river or Cypress Head or what have you. If you put the pavement there, then suddenly the way that water moves, it's different. It's going to outfall quicker or slower, and it's not going to enter the ground. It's not going to have time to settle like it would if there were, uplands or wetlands there. And so as part of that ERP program, you're making sure that the quantity and the quality of the water that's entering the system is, I think, at least the same or better, if we're talking about like nutrient loading, the same or better as it was prior to the activity. But that's the engineering side. That's not my bailiwick. We work with engineers on that. But the wetlands aspect, it has to do, it's sort of intrinsically linked to that whole notion of water and conveyance and not flooding out your neighbor. And so it all has to be done mindfully. And Florida's, I think, done a really good job. That if you want to look it up for some light reading, chapter 62-340 in the Florida Administrative Code is it defines a wetland. It talks about some of those tests that I said earlier, and it gives the process for delineating them. And that's kind of one of the foundational, that's sort of the foundational regulation on why we do what we do. But
How many of those codes do you have just like floating around?
That happens to be one of the prominent. 404 is another string of numbers. The Clean Water Act.
Wait, is 404 like an error? Like 404 error?
Oh, whenever you're
It could be to some, depending on the complexity of your property. It can feel like that.
Error.
It's not buffering. Yeah. I mean, the 404 process can be onerous. It's hard to navigate. That's your federal side. And this is pretty nuanced, and I doubt we have time to go into any one of these topics.
Yeah.
Could warrant its own podcast. But the Army Corps of Engineers under the Clean Water Act, which is, I think, under Nixon in the 70s, early 70s, as well as the Endangered Species Act, it was kind of the seminal measure to protect. I think was it the Cuyahoga or that river in Ohio that set on fire because it was so polluted.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the landmark instances where you would reference like the Clean Water Act. I could be incorrect here in my timeline, but.
Well, first of all, if I'm seeing a river on fire, it's biblical, and I'm like, I'm out.
Yeah.
Terrifying.
Sure.
Terrifying.
Sure.
Now, we had talked a little bit about, I kind of want to shift into what I was really excited to talk about. Are there panthers in the wetlands? Maybe not.
No. Panthers are a wetland-dependent species.
And not the hockey team.
No, yeah. I mean, they need water.
Those guys need.
Humans do, yeah.
That hockey team needs frozen water.
Frozen water.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, Zambonis.
Yeah.
You name it.
Isn't that so fun to watch?
Yeah.
Like-
I admittedly am not a sports guy. Are you
No,
talking
the Zamboni.
Yeah, I can enjoy that.
Yeah. I go ice.
Not the sports.
No, not the sports.
Hockey, the fights,
Yeah.
the Zamboni.
No, the Zamboni.
Therapeutic.
I know. My family and I go ice skating every year around like Christmas.
Mm-hmm.
And it's always like, okay, let's watch this man clean the ice. It's the best thing.
Yeah.
But anyways.
Yeah, no, that's an important aside.
Yes.
That's an important aside. We take great pride in our
That's right.
teams.
That's right.
Our Zambonis. So, panthers. Yeah, the Florida panther, as the name implies, it's basically endemic to Florida now, right? This was a species that once ranged across pretty much the entire southeastern U.S., east of the Mississippi, as far as I know, the only one. As a result of development and prior to the advent of some of these comprehensive plans that plan these cities out 30 years or so in advance, or these counties, there was a lot of development that incidentally squeezed out some of these big ranges. So you're talking about hundreds of miles for males when they're breeding, and now they've been sort of relegated to southwestern Florida, Collier County, Florida Panther National Wildlife Refuge, Big Cypress National Preserve. Those types of areas are where they really thrive. But this is a species that is down to between 120 and 230, I think, are the estimates. It's arguably one of the rarest mammals in Florida, and it happens to be extremely prevalent in the part of the state that our company does a lot of work in. But you can look at maps online, and you can see when there's old telemetry. So they put collars on these panthers. The FWC does, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and there's telemetry that goes pretty far north. But the vast majority of that is happening south of the Caloosahatchee River, and that's one of those two tributaries to Lake Okeechobee. Kissimmee flows in it from the north. Caloosahatchee flows out west to Estero Bay, and then you have the St. Lucie Canal that flows out towards, I guess, Port St. Lucie. May go into the Indian River. I don't know my geography.
The worst turnpike stop is Port St. Lucie.
Is it? Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, the river is more or less, I think, a canal, and then there's all that.
Okay.
Yeah. And parts of the Caloosahatchee are channelized. But anyhow, that's sort of a natural barrier to some of that movement of the panther now, especially as they reproduce in south of the Caloosahatchee. But there have been instances of the panther being documented north of the river. Females, and that's important. This is since the 70s, only 3 or 4 instances where that was the case. And that's kind of a good bellwether for, okay, maybe they reproduce. There's a chance for reproduction north of the river.
So you said they're protected.
Yes, they're federally endangered, meaning they're on the Endangered Species Act
And
U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
absolutely cannot be hunted.
Right. Yeah, that would be called take, and that would, there would be
You're going to
repercussions.
prison.
I mean, I don't know. We don't, fortunately, we don't deal with that side of things, the criminal prosecution.
Yeah, yeah.
You'd probably want to call up Mr. Williams first and see if he's got any contacts. They don't do that. They don't do that type of law, but
Lawyers always know somebody, though,
sure,
you know?
he's got connections. I
Yeah,
imagine.
yeah.
But yeah, they're federally endangered, which means if your project might impact their habitat, you would have to get, in most cases, what's called some form of take statement from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And that's usually done when you're doing all your wetland stuff. When you're getting a permit from either the Army Corps of Engineers or now in Florida, it's the FDEP in most cases. And so just like with wetlands, you'd have to mitigate and make up for impacts to that panther habitat. So there's what's called a panther focus area, and there's primary zone, secondary zone, and you can quantify those impacts using what's called the Panther Habitat Unit Analysis Calculator. And that we would come into play, that's where environmental or rather ecological consultants would come into play and help as the expert, as the consultant, help them navigate that side of the permitting process.
Yeah, and so, I mean, but what happens if your project, your development is going to impact these animals? And I mean,
so it's spelled out pretty clearly, but
Yeah.
there's some ambiguity. There's room in these permitting processes for not negotiation, but you get clarification, but ultimately you get either a biological opinion or some form of technical assistance from the federal agency, and it would spell out the measures that you need to implement with your construction to minimize take of that species, and that can be anything from disturbance to mortality. And these BOs, these biological opinions, if that's what your project receives, would spell out, actually it would quantify the amount of take. It can go that far as to say the project may result in, mortality to up to 2 panthers. And the thing you want to avoid, I've never dealt with, is if your project's going to jeopardize the continued existence of a species. I can't speak a ton of that because that's not something I personally had to thread, but at our company, I imagine at some point, and we've got over 100 years cumulatively of experience, someone has probably encountered that. But it's because they are so rare. It's just like with the gopher tortoise, the habitat is threatened, so the species is as well, because a tortoise lives in high and dry, easy to develop, easy to clear, don't have to bring in much fill type settings. That's really been enticing for developers over the years. And so, but to the state's credit, and to the federal government's credit, there are processes and permitting that is in place that you have to ensure you have before you can before you can initiate construction in most cases.
So we're talking about like mitigation banks.
Exactly. Yeah. Bringing it back to the analogs, the parallels between sort of the wetland mitigation banking that y'all might be more familiar with, to what's usually called like conservation banking, species conservation banking. So with the panther, there would be, in some cases, panther mitigation banks. If you can't provide those PHUs, those panther habitat units on site, then an option that may be available to you that you would work out and negotiate with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is buying PHUs from one of these banks. And that takes care of your incidental take.
okay.
And I say incidental take because it's not the intention of these projects to cause disturbance
Right.
or potentially mortality
Right.
to these species. It's incidental to the activity.
Right.
So
That's not the purpose of
Right.
building there, is to wipe out this, species. You're just building there because it's available and it looks like a good spot.
exactly.
Now, I want to say when we were talking on the phone that, what isn't there like some kind of like big panther forest, or there was like an area that,
Yeah, the Florida Wildlife Corridor.
yeah,
So I may have said, and I said this earlier in this conversation just now, but the Florida the Florida Panther National Wildlife Refuge.
Yeah.
It's a U.S. Fish and Wildlife. It's basically like a national park, if you want to think about it that way. It's not as accessible. It may not have the trails. This is along Alligator Alley, along 75. You'll see a big sign for it. And there's fencing along 75, and that's to prevent panthers from crossing.
I did not know that.
And
I've driven that road so many times. I had no idea.
Yeah, and periodically, there's low water crossings, for these cypress sloughs to continue to convey water to the Everglades. But there's also areas that are elevated slightly to allow large-ranging species like the panther to cross. And that actually can come into play for these residential developments. They may have to put in a panther crossing as part of their permitting. And these are costly endeavors. This is something
I do not want to get stranded on that road. My God.
Yeah, that would be so it's not accessible to the public, right? These are elevated roadways, and the panther crossing goes underneath the road.
Okay.
And these are areas where folks like Carlton Ward Jr., if you've heard of that name before, he's been instrumental in this whole Florida Wildlife Corridor concept before, but they'll put cameras there, remote cameras that get triggered by infrared light and so forth. And that'll capture this panther movement. But what I was describing to you on our phone call earlier was the Florida Wildlife Corridor. And there's legislation on this that passed in the last 1 or 2 years about, and this really is, I'd say this would come into play. I'm sure Dean's familiar with all of this. The intention is to work with stakeholders, ranchers, developers, municipality, you name it, and trying to kind of ensure that some of this pathway for these not only panthers but black bears preserved. So, how that affects our projects, that's kind of landscape scale stuff. And what we would be doing is more granular. But for these bigger projects, there could be some maybe consideration for that, is the notion of the continued existence of some of these species. So are these animals being moved to this area, like on purpose? Are they being captured and transported there, or are they just kind of naturally being pushed that way? So these species, you think about like the scrub jay. I know you talked about this with one of your other guests. They're birds. They can fly. I think the term is vagile, honestly. It's ambulatory. It can move.
Wild.
Yeah. I should look it up on my phone just to confirm. I may need to edit it out after. But I in all seriousness, I think that's the term. And so
having freedom to move about.
There you go. Chad verified that. Other species like, and so in those instances, we do a lot of burrowing owl permitting. Cape Coral, if you've ever been to Cape Coral, that is that's a hot spot for the Florida burrowing. They're cute, they're charismatic, people love them. They'll stare up at the sky at predators and rotate their heads, swivel them.
Go owls.
Go out. That's right.
FAU.
FAU, exactly. Some of my coworkers.
We were the burrowing owls.
There you go. Probably because that maybe that campus was built on some burrowing owl. Who knows?
It is. It was an Air Force base.
Okay.
In the 50s and 60s, I believe, decommissioned, and the airport was sold to state of Florida, turned into education, and the burrowing owls were nesting in between runways. So that's how. Do
you think that they did any mitigation?
Depends on what.
There is still habitat at the school. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the owl's it's state listed now, meaning it's protected under state legislature. It's not federally listed like the panther is, but you still have to get a permit if you want to dig up those burrows. If you want to stick a camera in them and scope them and see if they're occupied, you have to get a permit because that could constitute disturbance. I keep using that word. So for species like that, you dig them up. I mean, this is in a nutshell. This is hyper simplified, but you dig them up. And you kind of flush, they naturally flush. They'll find more habitat. You look at something like a gopher tortoise. We love the gopher tortoise, but they're just by virtue of them being more terrestrial and slower, they're not going to be able to get out of the way of danger. And so they will be as part of that permitting process. This one's through FWC because, again, it's a state-listed species, although they are federally listed in parts of the country. further north. But you'll get a permit to relocate them, and you'll take them to what's called a recipient site. So in those cases, yes, they're getting moved.
Yeah.
So in other instances, that may not always be the case, but that's why you have the take statement. But there are measures that are approved in management plans that you write that are incorporated into these documents, like the biological opinion, that will say, these are the things you need to do. Pre-construction surveys. You can't construct during the nesting season oftentimes with some of these birds because you might compromise them reproductively. They have chicks, but the adults are scared away, and so they stop bringing food to the chicks. So there's measures in place that are sorted out during the permitting process that are reducing the likelihood of these things occurring. So, and it's a fairly robust system. It's pretty well thought out, all things considered, given the complexity and just this concept of like quantifying nature, and it's pretty fascinating.
Well, that's what I was going to ask next is, so they have collars and trackers on these panthers.
Some of them.
So, but each year, is the population staying the same?
So every year, and I believe this is still the case, the FWC will produce a report about the panther population. And some of this information, it's interesting. They no longer release, I think, some of the telemetry, the mortality data, like the vehicular collision data. And I can't really speak entirely to that, but it's partly because that's really sensitive information.
Yeah.
A panther was hit here, so there must be panthers here. And panthers are like one of those species that was persecuted for a while. It was killed. I don't know exactly historically, but I imagine it would attack maybe their livestock, but they depredate mainly deer, hog, even raccoons, that sort of thing. But yeah, so you collar these panthers, and it's a percentage of the population, and I don't know the exact science to it, but they would estimate. That's why that range is so wide.
Yeah.
It's a small number, but it's a wide range, right?
Yeah. Well, it makes a big difference.
It's like saying, there's either 7 billion people on Earth or 14 billion. It's scaled. Scaled down. But so yeah, some of these panthers are collared, and they're tracked, and we have some of that data available to us to say, has there been panther telemetry on our project? But the big thing is whether you're in what's that panther focus area in the instance of the panther.
I don't want to go there. That's terrifying, honestly. And then you said that there's not a lot of trails there.
Oh. Well, the PFA, the panther focus area, that spans a lot larger range than that.
Oh, good.
The Panther Wildlife Refuge, Florida Panther National Wildlife Refuge that I'm talking about.
Are they here?
In Lakeland, specifically, are there telemetry points historically, maybe in the Green Swamp? Like I said, I don't know when that program started, when they started collaring these panthers. There's a lot of literature on it, but I don't want to misspeak, but if you look at that telemetry map, some of that is their relics. It's historical data that's still publicly available, and they've ranged up here. It's just there's major impediments to their movement. The river being one of them, and that's a natural impediment. But in short, they could be up here. It's just, again, with that things like the Florida Wildlife Corridor, maintaining those pathways, the pathway of the panther to get up to these areas, and ultimately, all these piecemeal projects, they may not be they're not being developed in light of each other, but these comprehensive plans, these things at the local level, they're intended to be thoughtful, and they're intended, and a lot of that comes into play with the entitlements process. They're intended to, limit density, or you look at the existing land use and say, can this type of zoning occur? And that's a hypersimplification, but there are layers of review that kind of, as a patchwork, maintain some of these pathways naturally, but necessarily there's some bigger legislation that's trying to make sure at a landscape scale, not at a project scale, that it sort of all comes together. And that's a lot of that's to, it's the whole intention, I think, of some of these landmark legislations like the ESA is to maintain this habitat and maintain the viability of the species. So
yeah, obviously there would have been a lot more panthers than what's now. And so I think it's important, that to not wipe them off the face of the planet.
Right, exactly. And that's the whole point of consulting with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on these projects is an allowable amount of disturbance that's not going to jeopardize the continued existence of that species. And this is all allowed. This is all something that, there's instances of people doing it the wrong way.
Yeah.
And that's illegal, but doing it the right way and threading some of these regulations, it's all intended to basically, either in the instance of wetlands, prevent downstream effects or flooding, or maintaining these wetlands because it recharges our aquifer and we drink that water and it prevents flooding and so forth. And then with the species, making sure, because there's intrinsic value there, making sure that they're not, compromised to such an extent that, they cease to exist. But
Yeah, and I think that's important for our clients here. It's not necessarily that your project or your development won't happen.
right.
It's just that you're going to have to maybe move some pieces around and hire somebody, like you, Tomasino, to, help them kind of navigate through troubled waters.
That's right. Yeah, bridge over troubled waters. I didn't know Simon and Garfunkel would play here, but you're absolutely right. People say, "Oh, there's wetlands on our property. Oh, there's tortoises."
Right.
That doesn't mean you can't develop it.
Right.
It's just going to be a little trickier, and it could be tricky to the extent that you need to get someone involved, like Robert Williams. But and maybe you need to compromise here and there, and
Yeah, you might have to change your plans.
Sure. And I won't elaborate on this, besides to say that that's where it's important to have a due diligence done. But these things can be known to people, to your clients, before they're acquiring land. They might be buyers, they might be sellers, or developers. And so knowing these things up front is important, because for one person, having an eagle nest in the middle of your property can be and depending on the size of the property, that can be a deal breaker. I'm not going through all of that. The buffers are 660 feet. Yeah, I can edge up to 330 or even into that if I get a incidental take permit from the service, but that's costly, it's time consuming. I don't want to deal with that. And so again, that's where that whole due diligence notion comes into play. I won't elaborate, but yeah, it can be built. It's just going to take a team.
Yeah.
And the projects, to return to an original point I made, they're prickly, right? So you get a bunch of experts and they help you navigate that.
I don't think I realized how big bald eagles are until I went to this. What is this on Lake Kissimmee? Chad, there's this island there, Brahma Island.
I'm unfamiliar with it, but
Okay, well, this thing was standing there. I swear it was 4 feet. It was huge.
Yeah, they're substantial. Their wingspans are. See, I get asked specifics about the species sometimes, and I can't always answer it because I'm an ecologist. I'm looking at the way these processes interact.
That was my bad.
Oh, I thought I heard a bird call.
It was.
That's funny. It was a cricket, but
Will that be heard?
It was a button that shouldn't have been clicked, I think.
Interesting aside, you hear the eagle calls in all these movies.
Yeah.
It's typically a red-tailed hawk.
Is that right?
Yeah, the eagle is more gull-like, is what it's described.
Is that right?
Yeah, you could play it on a
Like a seagull?
somewhat.
That
It's not as
disgusting.
yeah, it's not quite as
It's not majestic
awe-inspiring.
at all.
Yeah. But nevertheless,
It's disappointing.
I know it's always, no, but still, it's a reassuring.
I did not
call
send
of
you the
eagle.
video of that eagle carrying the deer.
There's no chance that was it's unlikely that was a bald eagle, but maybe
I'm gonna find it.
It's
I'm gonna
probably
find
a
it before you leave today.
gold.
potentially could be a golden eagle. But
Yeah.
they cast the ibex or something off. That would be Africa, but throws it off the
It was insane.
cliff.
I've never seen anything like it.
Yeah, but
I don't know if it was a deer. I think it was an antelope.
It was an animal that was
It
larger,
was a four-legged animal.
than a squirrel.
yeah, that paints a graphic image regardless. But
Yeah.
I mean, mainly they're preying on fish and carrion, actually, like roadkill. And so an eagle would be a scavenger, and that's stuff that it's bringing back to the nest if it's nesting season, which it is right now. But yeah, eagles are large, to your point. I've seen them pick up like not entire, I don't know if slat is the correct word, but slats of sod up to their nest for nesting material, they're powerful.
Yeah.
And their talons are large, but exactly their stats, their specifics, I couldn't elaborate. I want to say it's their
81
81
inches.
Inches? Okay. So,
Well,
Tip to tip.
it's a quick math.
Like a, oh,
That's
says
like
a-
7, that's huge.
yeah, golden is only 81 and a half. Is what
It's
they're
about
saying.
6 feet.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I did not know. You know, I think of like a falcon or like a chicken hawk, and I was like, that is the size of this bird, and I'm like, eye to eye with this. I'm on an air.
Freedom
Yeah.
freedom incarnate.
Oh,
Yeah, the very embodiment of freedom.
it's terrifying.
Yeah.
But anyways, you were saying that you can only
Yeah,
go
there's
so far up to their nest, or
right. There's buffers. There's protection zones, and interestingly enough, the bald eagle is not on the Endangered Species Act. It's a success story, so it's not in the same echelon as the panther. It's a success story. You've heard about Silent Spring, probably. A lot of us had to read that in school. Rachel Carson. She did a lot of pioneering work on showing that things like DDT pesticides, you know, they bioaccumulate and they compromise the integrity of the eggshell, and then the chicks die and yada yada. So, you know, she released that book, and it changed things. And the eagle was listed in the ESA on the Endangered Species Act, but as a result of some of these regulations, the population recovered. And so they got delisted. They got removed from that list, but they are still, there's legislation, the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. Those things protect the eagles. And in those regulations, that's where it spells out things like these protection zones. And typically it's 660 feet. If you're in that, you need to start looking at, okay, do I need to get a permit from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service? Or looking at the municipal level, the level of the county or the city, are there additional protections? In Lee County, where we do a lot of work, you have to prepare what's called a bald eagle management plan if you're going to develop within 660 feet of an eagle nest. And that's on top of what you might need from the service. And I say might need because it can be a little ambiguous. And that's where I think it's important to, if you have the grace of your client and you're far enough along in the process to say, this is sort of our conceptual site plan. If I present this in a way that, you know, is factual and this is what we intend to do to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, you may already, I mean, it's generally you wouldn't have your permit, you would have addressed this already, your ERP. But the service can sort of guide you on saying, well, what are you building? Are you building a mine that's going to require, are you demolishing things? Is there a natural buffer? What is the eagle already acclimated to? Is the nest right next to a road? And so all those things come into play, and them determining whether you're going to need one of these incidental take permits. But there's a good chance that if you're building within 660 feet that you're going to need to at least, not consult would be the wrong word, but involve the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And again, at the county level, in some instances, I'm not familiar with what Polk's regulations are, but you should still, you know, in your due diligence or in that process, consider things like that.
yeah.
So,
Yeah, it just says all bald eagle nest trees are protected by state and federal laws. The recommended protective buffer zone is 660 or less,
exactly.
depending on what activities or structures are already near it.
There you
So
go.
Yeah, so if they're
Or-
near a road, obviously they're like
They're used
pretty
to traffic,
acclimated to
yeah.
that.
And that's all, yeah, again, this is sound science that's going into some of these regulations. They understand. There have been studies or papers written or what have you. The seagull is not going to flush the nest. It's not going to leave. It's accustomed to this type of. So they bake that into the process, and they're just like with the wetlands thing. They're not going to patently say no, but let's figure this out based on the guidelines, based on the regulations, and that's what we try to. I mean, that's ultimately what we assist the client in doing. There might be monitoring that's required if you're building during the nesting season. It's multifaceted, but we can provide that service, and it's always something you consider, especially in Florida with with such an abundance of listed wildlife species and the wetlands. So,
And I know we had talked about people, graduates, they're trying to get into what you do.
yes.
And maybe they're saying the wrong things, or maybe they don't really know what to ask for or where to look. Do you have any
I do.
light you can shed on that?
I do, and I appreciate you bringing that up. I don't know how much time we have left here, but yes. So
45 seconds, go.
all right. That's like when on these radio stations they
Yeah.
try to make, okay, move it along, move it along.
Okay, Bob, you got 45 seconds.
The music's playing. So when I studied biology at Florida Southern, and I was fortunate that I knew about consulting. I knew about ecological consulting, and the distinction here, and this was brought up by one of your other guests, is that if someone's looking for a job out of college with a standard, say, biology degree, environmental science, and they put in environmental consulting, they may get a whole host of job descriptions, all the way from, remediation of hazardous waste, even up to, say, like septic tank cleanup, things of that sort, or these, you hear about phase 1, phase 2, waste studies, maybe even like an archaeological consultant. There's this whole umbrella. I think to refine your search, looking for ecological consulting would be beneficial, and that's just one of those. That's
It's
just
like an industry insider thing that,
Sure, it's minutia.
Yeah.
And it's a semantics thing.
Yeah.
I mean, you might hear us refer to environmental consultants, and that's not entirely inaccurate, but environmental usually refers more to that. I'll say like the abiotic side of things. But I wanted to say that I benefited greatly from an internship program in college. One of the professors, the wife of one of the, or sorry, the husband of one of the professors at the college, he worked at a firm in Tampa. They're not a consulting firm. They're technically a nonprofit, but there's a lot of parallels with consulting. It's just, I guess it's the structure of their profits and so forth that make them nonprofit. But I was fortunate enough, I had the good grace to be with those folks and get exposed to this industry. And I may not, that plus, it's all serendipity. That plus the fact that I was in a town where Passarella Associates started, those two things in concert, I think, led to where I am today. But had I not known about that, had I not asked around, it was my ecology professor in college, Dr. Langford, shout out, that put me in touch with Dr. Halstead, with Neil, and I still keep in touch with him today. And so these are things that might not be apparent to students.
Yeah.
But it's something that, and in the last couple months, I've had the privilege of talking to some students who've reached out to our company, which I'm just chuffed by. I love it. I love the fact that they are taking that initiative. A student from UF, and then the nephew of one of our one of my coworkers who's retired now. They reached out. They wanted to know more about the industry. So,
yeah, I think that's important. And obviously, like, you don't know what you don't know, especially coming out of college, and you don't know what to ask all the time. Mm-hmm. So I'm actually really glad that you had brought that up in your email, because I thought, yeah, that's pretty interesting. It's like, I think back to when I graduated, I still don't know much, but like, what did I know? I had no idea what to do or like who to contact. So it's good to know that Tomasino's out there.
Tomasino's here, and I'm happy to field your questions. But we don't have an internship program.
Okay.
But there are opportunities at other firms. You just got to ask. It's not always apparent on their websites. But the firm I did intern with was Wildlands Consulting, not Wildlands Consulting, but it's Wildlands, and they specifically offer an internship program, and I think things like that are pretty
top notch for everybody.
Yeah, tantamount to success.
Well, I mean, you can sit in school all day, but until you have real world experience, like, things don't connect.
Sure. Yeah.
Is there anything you want to say about your company?
Sure. Yeah. At Passarella Associates, we're kind of a full service ecological consulting firm that provides wetlands mitigation, delineation, monitoring services, environmental permitting, and listed species surveys and permitting, along with everything else that might entail.
And everything that you need to know about panthers, eagles, any wetlands, anything.
Yeah, just reach out to
Call
us.
him about eagles,
Yeah. I'm going to find that video before you
panthers,
leave.
bears.
My gosh.
Yeah, you name it. All the charismatic megafauna.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. Taminosian,
That's it.
Jacob Taminosian,
Correct.
all the way from Fort Myers. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. I appreciate y'all having me.
Yeah.
Really enjoyed the show. And
We try. We're not experts, but the people over on my left are always
you're
experts.
an
So
expert at this, at a minimum.
I still would not say that. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.